Snyder.
Chapter 19. Run. Matthew Simmons. Virginia, 2018. As I turned away from the infected town, intending to head back into the forest and hike as far away from civilization as I could, I noticed I wasn't alone. A car had crept its way towards me and parked in the middle of the road about 20 yards back. I cursed myself for not hearing it coming. But given the chaos of mangled cars and surging undead on the other end of the hill I stood atop, I didn't linger too long on the idea. A man popped open the driver's side door and stood up. He held a shotgun, was smart enough not to point it at me for a split second before deciding I wasn't acting as crazy as everyone else seemed to be. There were a few other people in the car with him, and I could see blood on one of the backseat passengers as they clutched the wound, pale and frightened. The sound of the car's engine radiated out into the surrounding forest and down the hill. But as I quickly turned to check behind me, I was fortunate to find no undead had noticed him yet. I returned my attention to the man as his voice called out loud and foolishly. "Get in the car," he shouted, thinking he was doing me some kind of favor. I shook my head, hoping he'd give up quick, get back in the car, and drive the fuck away. He didn't. "Come on, hurry up!" "Turn your engine off," I cried, trying to keep my voice just loud enough that he could hear and just quiet enough that the undead wouldn't. "What? Just get in, we have room." "Shut up," I hissed, anxiously glancing around as the number of distant screams from the living grew fewer and fewer. "They're attracted to noise. Now turn your engine off." "This is your last chance," he shouted, too panicked and too afraid to listen to a word I said. "We need to leave, now!" Suddenly, the wounded passenger that I'd noticed in the back seat leaned over and sunk their teeth into one of the people in the car. They screamed hysterically, high and shrill, drawing the attention of the man with the shotgun. He cried out, "Jesus Christ!" and turned his gun towards the car, firing a round into the side of the infected and blowing off its arm. It continued to bite the other passenger, unaffected by the blast, and the man took aim again. I swallowed a deep breath and swiveled around to see that now nearly every undead on the hill had taken notice and would soon overrun our location. The man continued to fire his weapon and scream, bewildered and shocked by the actions of those he had tried to save. I shook my head and ground my teeth out of disgust for the horrendous stupidity of my fellow man. I turned towards the woods and began sprinting, trying to distance myself as much as I could from the area, trying to escape the now hundreds of undead that dredged in my direction. The forest circled the perimeter of the town from what I could remember of the map, and as I moved swiftly in between the trees, I made sure to keep a close eye on my proximity to its borders. The sounds of screams and gunshots from behind me stopped after a short while, and the distant moans of the undead lumbering slowly in my pursuit faded with them. I breathed heavily, my rifle swiveling back and forth in front of me, ready and waiting for the next threat to show itself. And sure enough, it didn't take long to find me. Stragglers wandered the woods, popping up every few minutes the further I ran. I didn't dare fire a shot to put them down or stop to bust open their heads. I quickly came to realize that they had already surrounded me, coming from all directions as soon as the man's shots had rung out in the air. The only thing working to my advantage was the slope of the land as I spotted a steep 45-degree hill that dove down sharply into a ravine, covered with trees and loose dirt. It was the only way for me to try and escape. I stepped up onto the edge of the slope, looked behind me at the approaching undead, and stepped forward, using the many trees to brace myself as I descended down it. Undead clumsily stepped over branches and roots, falling flat on their faces and tumbling down the slope behind me, snapping spines and breaking limbs as they crashed into trees. I dove from one sure foot into the next, avoiding the fallen lumps of ghouls caught against trunks that used whatever extremities still worked to try and grab hold of me. As I came crashing into another tree, I leaned down and picked up a thick rock wedged between its exposed roots. I brushed it off to find a secure grip and looked around for the next tree to jump to, spotting the moaning undead lodged where I needed to land. I held the rock, just small enough that I could swing it with one arm and just big enough that I could bash in skulls with it. Then, as I torpedoed down the hillside, I coordinated my lunge with the swing of my arm, cracking the head of the ghoul lodged against the tree. Splatters of blood and goo shot out of its freshly opened brains, and I flinched, trying to avoid the spray from its head as much as I did the length of its reach. I paused once more, looking down to the base of the hill to see a group of nearly 20 ghouls beginning to form, looking right at me, but unable to climb the hill. I thrust myself up against another tree for support, stopping my descent abruptly and watching as a few more undead tumbled past my position. I breathed harshly and looked around for another way out, catching eye of a fallen cluster of trees that stretched above the reach of the undead. The only problem was it lay nearly 50 yards away horizontally, meaning I'd have to move slowly along the steep slope to keep myself from falling, all the while praying that no fallen undead boulders would come crashing down and pull my legs out from under me. Their moans grew louder and closer. I could feel their empty eyes upon me, reaching out for their next victim. I took my first steps, swinging my rifle around my shoulder and holding my arms out from my sides to keep my balance. The tender moss under my feet gave way with each step, and I swung my arms to cope. My feet slid down the slope, and I pulled the rock in one hand down sharply to stop myself from falling, using it like an anchor to move more easily. I looked up the hill as I heard the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling to witness another undead who had walked itself over the edge of stable ground. It smashed into the ground, face over ass, building up momentum and coming right at me. I stared at it anxiously, watching it bounce one way, then the other. But as it came closer, I judged it would land right on top of me at any moment. I dove forward, dodging its blow, but losing my grip. I slid down the hill and flailed my arms out, grabbing a tree just before I entered a clearing of dirt leading to the patch of ghouls waiting below. I pulled myself up and spit out a mouthful of leaves, hearing more and more undead fall down the slope towards me. The rock I'd been using as an anchor was gone, and my bag had nearly fallen as well. The place of down-clustered trees that I needed to reach was still 40 or more yards away. I swore at myself and clanked my head onto the trunk of the tree my chest pressed against, watching my rifle swing off my shoulder and dangle by its strap. Then, looking at its finely clean barrel, a grin spread across my face as I realized what to do. I pulled the rifle into my hands, double-checked for fallen ghouls, and stabbed it into the dirt, bridging the gap between myself and the next tree I could use to stay standing. The herd of ghouls below followed me each inch that I moved, crawling along the patch of even ground at the base of the slope. I leapt from trees like a squirrel, praying with each move that the barrel of my gun would hit a firm enough patch of dirt to keep me from falling to my death. Then, as I reached the last tree before the cluster of branches and trunks that I could use as a bridge over the undead, I looked up once more to see a remarkable sight. Hundreds of undead now walked towards the edge of the hill, seconds away from crashing down into those below, like a herd of buffalo unknowingly running off a cliff to their deaths. And just as they started piling over and thundering down, I took my final leap for the tangled heap of fallen trees, grabbing hold of one and pulling myself under it for cover. The roaring stampede of fallen undead, bouncing off trees and crashing into one another, sent bodies flying in every direction. I hung on for dear life, praying that the trees I dangled from would stay lodged where they were despite the beating they received. Leaves and bugs fell out of the dying wood, covering my face and chest. I shook my head and fluttered my eyes, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening. But before the dust and debris cleared the air, I noticed a growing calm where the rumbling had been. The undead had stopped falling down the slope. A tangled heap of hundreds of squirming bodies lay only 20 feet below me, broken and mangled parts of moaning ghouls, no longer able to rise to their feet and follow in my footsteps. I hoisted myself up and flung myself onto the top of the fallen trees I had hung under for cover. I dusted myself off and took a seat, banging my rifle against a log to try and clear the dirt out of the chamber. Then, looking out over the sight that I would have never imagined in a million years, I let out a hearty laugh of disbelief. The undead had killed themselves, and those that could still moan and move lay under or squished against so many bodies that they'd likely end up buried by corpses where they were. Of course, I wasn't out of the woods yet, figuratively or literally. because as much of a thrill and a surprise it was to have survived the impossible, a few hundred dead ghouls was nothing in a town with a population of nearly 15,000. I let myself laugh, savoring the moment's solace before I'd have to run again.